Watch more programs like this on cable and stream with PCN Select. Subscribe at PCNTV.com.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I know it doesn't sound like I'm using a microphone, but we have the Pennsylvania Cable Network recording tonight's program, so we're using the microphones so they can hear us the best that they can. My name is Morgan. I'm from the Jefferson Educational Society. We have been holding lectures here at Edinboro University since this summer. We're very excited to be able to move our programming out further in the county so everyone can get a chance to learn some new things. Right now, we are actually in the middle of one of our biggest times of year. It's called our Global Summit. We bring in internationally and nationally renowned speakers to Erie County to give lectures on a lot of their life experiences, political experiences, things in that nature. We do have the lineup out front in the lobby if you'd like to take a look at that. And if you have any questions, I'll be around. But we're here tonight to discuss Colonial Pennsylvania and Native Americans. We have Larry Flatley here to discuss his knowledge on the subject. Before we get started, I have a couple quick announcements. If you are a student of Edinboro University, there is a sign-up sheet. If you didn't sign in, make sure you go do that before you leave tonight, just so you can get credit for coming tonight. We also have a couple handouts left over, so if you didn't grab one, we do have a couple left over in the lobby for tonight. Just another quick reminder, please don't forget to turn off or silence your cell phones out of respect for the audience and our speaker tonight. Larry Flatley is an Erie native. He grew up on the east side of Erie and graduated high school from Cathedral Prep and graduated college from the University of Pittsburgh, and he also attended the law school of University of Pennsylvania. He has practiced law for 38 years and is now retired. Since his retirement, he has been working on history and studying history through Pitt's OLLI program. He has authored 2 articles for the Journal of Erie Studies, and he has presented numerous lectures. He also presented the one that you're about to hear tonight at the Jefferson at our home base in May of 2019. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Larry Flatley to the stage.
Thank you very much, Morgan, for the kind words. William Penn sailed up the Delaware River in 1682. He brought along a land grant that he had from King Charles II. It made Penn the largest private landowner in the British Empire. But there was a catch, a big one. For centuries, Native American people had been living on the land that the grant called Pennsylvania. And those native people weren't parties to Penn's deal with the king. Penn arrived with a business plan. Simply put, sell land to Europeans to make money. Before he left England, Penn had contracts to sell 300,000 acres of Pennsylvania. On arrival, step 1 for Penn was to get Native Americans off some of the land so he could make good on those contracts. In fairness, William Penn wasn't like other English colonizers. He didn't try to seize the land using military force. Penn was a Quaker, a pacifist. He wanted to buy land from native people, and he promised to deal fairly with them. Penn made several early deals. The most celebrated was his legendary 1682 treaty with the Lenapes. Now, why did I put the word legendary in air quotes? That's because modern historians aren't sure there ever was a deal with the Lenapes in 1682. But even so, Penn's treaty with the Lenapes has been the subject of several works of art. One is a 1772 painting by an artist named Benjamin West. West was a prominent historical painter in the 1770s. He was a favorite of an English king I'll bet you've heard of, George III. The title of this painting is Penn's Treaty with the Indians. Today it hangs in the State Museum of Pennsylvania in Harrisburg. In 1771, Thomas Penn commissioned Benjamin West to paint it. Thomas was one of William's sons. In the early 1770s, Thomas was the proprietor of Pennsylvania. He was the owner of a 75% interest in the Pennsylvania colony and its land business. Let's look briefly at the West painting and talk a little bit about it. I'm going to use my high-tech laser pointer here that I carry with me wherever I go. You see the painting. It depicts a scene along the Delaware River in what's modern Philadelphia under a large fabled tree. I think it was an elm, perhaps an oak. Penn is in the middle of the painting. Fat guy with a tri-cornered hat. And there are Native Americans on one side of him, Quakers and businessmen on the other. You can see in the front of the painting, trade is being conducted between the Quakers and the Native Americans. And they are negotiating that fabled treaty of 1782. The scene depicts peace, harmony, and prosperity in colonial Pennsylvania. And that's certainly its theme and certainly the tone of that painting. A second painting is by an artist, 19th century artist. Now, recall, Penn arrives in 1682. This painting is done in 1771, 72. Now we're going to move to the 19th century, the 1800s. And this painting is by an artist named Edward Hicks. It's titled Peaceable Kingdom. It's in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. today. Hicks was a Quaker, an admirer of William Penn. Hicks did a series of Peaceable Kingdom paintings, more than 60. All of them include animals. All of them include wild and domesticated animals right next to each other. The cow, the lion, the wolf, and the sheep, right together. Predator and prey, but no one's threatening anyone. There's harmony among the animals. There's harmony between humans and the animals. Notice the infant between the tiger on one side and lion on the other. And more importantly, in the background of the painting on the left side is William Penn again, along the Delaware River, under the big tree, negotiating the Treaty of 1682, the fabled Treaty of 1682 with the Lenapes. Again, the theme is peace, harmony, and prosperity in colonial Pennsylvania. The term Peaceable Kingdom, the title of this work, eventually came to be a term that was used to describe Pennsylvania in the early colonial days, as in Pennsylvania was the peaceable kingdom. For his part, William Penn used the term holy experiment. He described his holy experiment being that Quaker immigrants would live peaceably with the Native Americans who are already there. That, in Penn's mind, was his holy experiment. For context to these paintings, consider a series of events that occurred in 1763, before either of these paintings was done. 1763 was an important year in Penn's colony. In the borderlands, or on the frontier, and I'll use the terms borderlands and frontier, I'll get that later. Borderlands and frontier interchangeably, 1763 brought war. That was called Pontiac's War. In Pennsylvania, it was a war between the colonial government and its settlers and Native Americans. It was the second such war in just a period of a few years. On the Pennsylvania side, members of local militia units played a large role. Near Harrisburg, then called Paxtang or Paxton, there were several local militias. Historians refer to those local militias as the Paxton Boys. The Paxton Boys despised Native Americans, all Native Americans. In December 1763, the Paxton Boys focused their rage on a small group of Native Americans called the Conestogas. The Conestogas lived along the Susquehanna River. They lived on land that William Penn had personally guaranteed them in a written treaty dated 1701. Here's what Benjamin Franklin said. I guess that man needs no introduction. What Benjamin Franklin said and wrote about what the Paxton Boys did in late 1763. And let's go to the next slide and I'll show you a first edition of Franklin's pamphlet containing his narrative about the Paxton Boys. And if you're good on your Roman numerals, down here is 1764. Franklin wrote this within a couple of months after the events that he wrote about. Here's a quote from Franklin. On Wednesday, the 14th of December, 1763, 57 men came all well mounted and armed to Conestoga, where they surrounded the small village of Indian huts. Only 3 men, 2 women, and a young boy were found at home. These poor defenseless creatures were immediately fired upon, stabbed, and hatcheted to death. All of them were scalped and otherwise terribly mangled. When the troop of Paxton Boys, enraged that the other 14 Conestogas had escaped the massacre, then they rode off. End of quote. As Franklin said, 14 Conestogas were away from the village at the time of the raid. They were brought to Lancaster and into protective custody in the Lancaster County Workhouse. On December 22nd, 8 days after the raid, Pennsylvania Governor John Penn, the nephew of proprietor Thomas Penn, issued a proclamation. He called for the Paxton Boys to be brought to justice, and he asked that the 14 remaining Conestogas be brought to Philadelphia for their safety. They weren't. Franklin describes what the Paxton Boys did next. Quote, hearing that the remaining 14 Indians were in the workhouse at Lancaster, the Paxtons suddenly appeared in that town on the 27th of December. 50 of them, armed as before, went directly to the workhouse and by violence broke open the door. When the Conestogas saw that they had no protection, nor could possibly escape, they divided into their little families, the children clinging to their parents. And in this posture, they received the hatchet. Men, women, and little children were every one inhumanely murdered in cold blood. Franklin closed his narrative by saying, quote, this wickedness cannot be covered. The guilt will be on the whole land of Pennsylvania until justice is done. End quote. Not one of the Paxton Boys was ever charged, prosecuted, or punished for the Conestoga massacres. Proprietor Thomas Penn's commission for the Benjamin West painting was done 8 years after Conestoga. I'm talking tonight about colonial Pennsylvania and Native Americans. That is from William Penn's arrival through the end of the American Revolution. From Penn's arrival in 1682 until the mid-1750s, over 70 years, things were more or less peaceful. But there were problems between colonial Pennsylvania and Native Americans. Problems that existed from the beginning. Problems that got progressively worse. In the mid-1750s, those problems exploded into violence. From 1755 to 1783, Pennsylvania and its native inhabitants fought 3 brutal terroristic wars. The atrocities on both sides were appalling. The Peaceable Kingdom became what historian James Merrill has called an abattoir. That's a French word. Translated, it means slaughterhouse. Tonight I'm discussing how and why the Peaceable Kingdom became a slaughterhouse. But before I do, I have a few words about food. Yes, food. History is not a 7-course meal. Events don't follow each other in a logical manner, one event at a time. History is much more like Irish stew. It's all mixed up. The ingredients flavor each other. Many different things are happening at any one time. A strict chronological approach won't work for colonial Pennsylvania and Native Americans. So I'll be talking more about themes and trends than about dates and events, clean-cut cause and effect. And that's especially so for the period before the mid-1750s. If things get a little difficult, and I don't see that people have handouts. Do people have handouts? Okay, good. Good. I'm glad to see that, because if things get a little difficult, don't hesitate to look at the handouts. There's a timeline of events that'll help anchor you chronologically. There's a list of people, groups, and places that's in alphabetical order. If I'm flying around and talking about this group or that, you've kind of lost me. Feel free to reference that. There are some maps in there that'll help orient you geographically. And there's even a short list of books if you have interest beyond tonight and want to learn more about this subject. The human history of what you and I call Pennsylvania started about 16,000 years ago. Modern archaeology proves that native people were in western Pennsylvania at about 14,000 BC. And I'm going to show you a slide here that's a map of the state. That's obviously the modern borders of Pennsylvania. Those didn't exist then. And you'll see the three river system, the Delaware, etc. There are no names on this one because 16,000 years ago, nobody had given them a name that we know of today. But I've marked on here a place called the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. That's where the archaeology was done that proved the presence of Native Americans roughly 14,000 BC. By the way, that work was done, led by Dr. Ottavazio, who's now at Mercyhurst University. He led the team that made that archaeological discovery and is still, to my knowledge, working on it to this day. So let's step back a little bit and think about this. Native people were in Pennsylvania roughly 157 centuries before Europeans. Not much is known about those ancient people. The Monongahela is what the archaeologists call them. We know much more about the natives of the 17th and 18th century. And let me give you 3 slides to give you a further geographical orientation here. Here's your river system again, this time with the rivers marked in. Familiar, I assume, to everyone. The Delaware River on the eastern border of the state, the Susquehanna River system in the central part of the state, and out here in the west, Monongah and Allegheny meeting to form the Ohio at what today is Pittsburgh. Now, another map that helps orient you is, let's talk about where Native Americans were in roughly the year 1600, at the beginning of the 17th century. Now, I've written here on the top, outside of what's modern Pennsylvania, Iroquois League. The Iroquois was a federation of native nations who conglomerated and lived in the part of what's today upstate New York, north of the Pennsylvania border. They were there. Within the state itself, you've heard me already mention the Lenapes. They lived along the Delaware River. The Munsee lived along the Delaware River too. Now later, it gets a little tricky. The Lenapes and the Munsee were referred to collectively, along with some others, as the Delawares. You'll hear me talking about the Lenapes for a while, but more later about the Delawares. In the central part of the state, you had the Susquehannocks, were the traditional nation that was there for centuries. The Shawnees were also there as well by the beginning of the 17th century. They had moved out and then back in. And I mentioned earlier the Conestogas. They were descendants of the Susquehannocks, and in the 18th century lived along the Susquehanna River. Out in the west, I have the Monongahela, again in quotes, because those people, we don't know what their name was, how they named themselves. It's only the archaeologists have called them the Monongahelas. And the Eries, Erie Nation, they were in the northwestern part of the state, the Monongahelas in the southwestern part of the state. The oddity about this depicts roughly the situation in 1600. By 1680 at the latest, the Monongahelas and the Eries were gone. And the western part of Pennsylvania was relatively uninhabited at that point, and would only become re-inhabited at the beginning of the 18th century with migrations from the Delawares and the Shawnees across the mountains for reasons you'll hear about later. And then a final geographic orientation. These are 18th century settlements or forts. Philadelphia, of course, is where you would expect it to be, as is Easton. I talked earlier about Paxtang, Conestoga, and Lancaster. That's where they were in the 18th century. Shamokin and Wyoming were Native American towns along the Susquehanna. And in the western part of the state, we're flipping all the way now into the 1750s. These were the forts that the French built and then were later taken by the British and rebuilt by the British. In Erie County, of course, were Forts Presque Isle and LaBeouf. In Venango County was Fort Venango. And of course, there were Forts Duquesne and Pitt at what today is the center of modern Pittsburgh. You might be surprised to hear that Europeans were in the Delaware Valley of Pennsylvania decades before William Penn. Sweden had trading posts by 1638. The Dutch arrived in 1655 and displaced the Swedes. In 1664, Britain assumed control of the Dutch North American colonies. These early colonists are very significant. Mostly those Europeans were traders, not settlers. They came to do business with the Native Americans, not to settle on the Native American land and start farms. And their numbers before Penn were very small. It's estimated that there were something like 400 Swedes in the Delaware Valley in the 1640s, and maybe 700 Europeans, even after the first British started coming in the 1660s. Now, these European traders are significant because they brought European diseases with them. Diseases like smallpox, diseases which were previously unknown in North America. Those diseases were a catastrophe for Native Americans. Epidemic followed epidemic. For example, it's estimated that during the 1630s, smallpox killed roughly half of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois population. Now, I need to mention the Iroquois. The word that's come down to us these days for the 5 nations, later 6 nations, that made up the Iroquois Confederacy is Iroquois. But that name actually came from the French. They called themselves the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Long House. That's the correct way to refer to them. But because Iroquois is so full throughout history and widely used today, I'll be calling them the Iroquois Confederacy, even though the proper name is the Haudenosaunee. That epidemic in the 1630s that killed roughly half of the Iroquois population was only one of a series of epidemics that hit the Beyond diseases, native life was disrupted before Penn by European trade. Native people wanted to trade animal skins and furs for European goods. That was beneficial for Native Americans, at least early on. That trade was part of a transatlantic trading network. Beaver fur hats, just to take one example, became very popular in Europe, particularly in France. Supplying the European market for beaver became a reason for natives to trap more and more animals. Over time, natives became economically dependent on European trade. They came to rely on copper kettles rather than the earthenware that they had made. And they needed European guns and ammunition for hunting and much more. Native groups found themselves in competition with other native groups for furs and skins. That competition heightened pre-existing rivalries. The stakes became higher. The advantage went to those who had access to guns and ammunition. Let's go back and talk a little bit again about the Erie Nation. They're a good example of this. They found themselves in an Iroquois beaver war, a war with the Senecas and the Iroquois Confederacy over sources of beaver. The Senecas and the Iroquois had access to English and French guns and ammunition. The Eries didn't. By 1680, the Eries were gone. They were either killed, driven off, or assimilated into the Seneca Nation. From the time of Penn's arrival, his colony caused additional problems for native people. Let's see if I can get back to the right slide. Okay, now we're going to talk about the themes and trends during the period of Penn's arrival in 1682 until the world broke loose in 1755. In part, the problems that the colony caused resulted because Penn was an absentee proprietor. William Penn was in Pennsylvania only 5 or 6 of the 36 years that he was the proprietor of the colony. A variety of issues kept Penn in England. He was in constant financial and legal trouble. He was in debtor's prison once. His colonial charter was revoked for a few years before he got it back. A business partner even sued him, claiming that Penn had given the colony away. And Penn had court battles with Lord Baltimore over where the line was between Pennsylvania and Maryland. As a result, Penn needed to make a lot of money in Pennsylvania, and he needed to do it in a hurry. He brought in Europeans quickly. As I mentioned, there were somewhere 700 to 1,000 Europeans in the Delaware Valley when Penn arrived. He brought in 7,200 settlers in his first 3 years. By 1700, the number of Europeans in Pennsylvania exceeded 20,000. And it's estimated that at 1740, that total number of Europeans was up to 100,000 and more. Now, William Penn sincerely wanted to coexist with native people. But William Penn was a product of his times and a colonizer. The coexistence Penn envisioned was always going to be on European terms. Native Americans would be welcome to live in Penn's colony if they gave up their independence, and if they gave up their culture, and if they gave up their economic system. Now, William Penn needed to be at peace with native people. After all, he was a pacifist. His colony didn't even organize a provincial militia until decades after his death. But Penn, and especially his heirs, weren't naive. They knew 17th and 18th century North America was a dangerous place. So the Penns had a backup plan to native diplomacy. They recruited thousands of Scotch-Irish immigrants to come to Pennsylvania. The Scots-Irish had a reputation as fighters. In fact, when I was looking at the Edinburgh of Edinburgh University website, I saw that there's a statue to a fighting Scot right here on campus. That reputation still exists. The Scots-Irish were thought of as fighters, so the Penns brought them in, thousands of them, and put them on the colony's borderlands. Not in Philadelphia, out in the borderlands, the frontier. That's where conflict with Native Americans was most likely to happen. The Scots-Irish, in effect, were a buffer between Philadelphia and those natives who didn't want to assimilate into Pennsylvania. Penn's European immigrants brought along their own ways of living. Settlers brought European farming practices with them. The European settlers, generally speaking, wanted large tracts of land to support the crops that they liked to raise. They relied on domesticated livestock, and they let their cows and pigs roam and forage far and wide. These European ways were a problem for Native Americans. In general, Native Americans didn't raise livestock. They hunted and trapped. Hunting and trapping, of course, are best done in forests, not on cleared farmland. Every time a settler cleared part of Penn's woods, there was that much less forest for natives. When European livestock roamed, additional forest areas were ruined and native crops were often destroyed. And those problems were caused by legal landowners. The colony, and in turn native people, were plagued by squatters. Settlers who cleared and claimed land that they hadn't paid for. Land the Penns hadn't purchased from Native Americans. Now the Penns didn't like squatting. There wasn't any profit in that. But in practical terms, the Penns couldn't stop it. The colony didn't have political control in the borderlands. Squatting got much worse between 1712 and 1731. In 1712, William Penn suffered a debilitating stroke. His second wife, Hannah Callowhill Penn, took control. She was the de facto proprietor. William's death in 1718 triggered a court battle over his estate. The legal dust didn't settle until 1731, a 13-year lawsuit. Now, as a retired lawyer, I have to tip my hat to a bunch of lawyers who got a saddle on a case and wrote it for 13 years. Hannah's sons, at the end of the day, ended up in control. Her son Thomas was the most active in overseeing the colony. By 1746, Thomas owned a 75% interest and was the unrivaled proprietor of the colony. He stayed in that ownership interest until his death, almost on the eve of the American Revolution. The uncertainty from 1712 to 1731 was a bonanza for squatters. The Penn family, in fact, wasn't minding their land office store. The Penns pursued a series of land deals with the Iroquois. Now recall my earlier comment in the slide with the location, too far back, the slide with the location of the Native American groups in the 17th century and then into the 18th century. They were all over Pennsylvania, and that was a big problem for the Penns. Often, several native groups had claims to the same piece of land, and the rights that they claimed in the land were nothing at all like English common law property rights. So it was difficult for the Penns to get the kind of title that their lawyers wanted. So the Penns solicited help from the Iroquois League. The idea was for the Penns to make deals with the Iroquois, and that the League would bargain not only for itself, but also for the native people who were actually living on the land that the Penns wanted. After a deal was made, the Iroquois would make sure the other native groups fell into line. Now, Iroquois power, great as it was in decline in the mid-18th century. But the Six Nations were still relatively powerful, and they were expert negotiators. They knew very well how to leverage the power that they had. The Iroquois had long-standing claims to much of the land that's in modern Pennsylvania, and claims to supremacy over groups like the Delawares and the Shawnees, who were actually living on that land. Ultimately, what mattered in the early to mid-18th century was that the Iroquois claimed huge tracts of land that the Penns wanted to buy, and they appeared to have the power to back up those claims. Now, the Iroquois had good reasons for wanting to make these deals with the Penns. One was that Pennsylvania was a new source of European trade goods for the Iroquois nations. Their traditional English source was New York. They also had a traditional source in New France. The Iroquois were expert, as I indicated earlier, at playing those groups off against each other. Having Pennsylvania in the mix now gave them three groups to play off against each other. So in that sense, doing deals with Pennsylvania was good business for the Iroquois. Second, the Iroquois was selling land that none of the Iroquois people lived on. So that was another reason it was good for them to do business with the Penns. For the colony, the appeal of land deals with the Iroquois was pretty simple. It was one-stop shopping, plus the Iroquois could be counted on to enforce the deals. Remember, colonial Pennsylvania didn't have a provincial militia, so they would look to the Iroquois to do the dirty work. During the 1730s and 40s, and even later, the Iroquois and the Penns made a series of land deals. As a result, Lenapes, Munsees, Delawares, Shawnees, and others were forced to give up their land. Dispossessed, they migrated elsewhere. Some of them migrated to what today is western Pennsylvania. A good example of one of these Iroquois land deals is the so-called walking purchase. Now here's a spoiler for you. When historians write about the walking purchase, the word infamous is almost always used in the same sentence, as in infamous walking purchase. The Penns started making deals in 1736 and 37 for a tract of land along the Delaware River. They did a 1736 treaty with the Iroquois, and then they approached the Delawares to try to get the Delawares, who were actually living on the land, to leave. To induce the Delawares into the deal, Thomas Penn and his agents employed fraudulent deeds, altered maps, and what has generously been called creative surveying. At the end of the day, the Penns were to get the land that a man could walk through the woods in a day and a half. Now that sounds funny to us today, but that was not an uncommon way to measure land in that time period. These were dense woods, and it was pretty well understood how far a man could walk in a day, or 2 days, or 3 days. This deal was a day and a half. On the day of the walk, the Penns sent 3 men, trained long-distance runners. They didn't wander through the woods. They went through a path that had been cleared for them in advance. They had the benefit of guides and pack horses. The native observers who were there left in disgust early the first morning of the walk. The runners ended up going twice as far as was reasonably expected. That's where creative surveying came in. And that, as a result of creative surveying, that amount of land was in turn doubled yet, so that the Penns claimed 4 times what the Delawares had expected they were going to get. The walking purchase turned out to be larger than the modern state of Rhode Island. 1,214 square miles. Let's go to this map. The darkest green area over here is the land encompassed by the walking purchase. The orange dotted line is where the runners went for the day and a half. It was understood that they weren't going to possibly get to this creek here, but they ended up going that far, about twice as far as had been anticipated. Now here's where the creative surveying comes in. The surveyors were to draw a line, and by the way, that's modern Wrightstown, Pennsylvania to modern Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. The surveyors were supposed to draw a line back to the Delaware River. The Delawares thought they'd draw one that looked like this. The Penn surveyor said, oh no, we're going off at a 45-degree angle, all the way up here, effectively doubling the area of the walking purchase. The Delawares felt they'd been cheated. They refused to leave the walking purchase land. Penn family called on the Iroquois. Eventually, in 1742, the Iroquois forced the Delawares off the land. Among the Delawares who moved west was a young man named Shingus. Shingus was a nephew of the Delaware leader who was forced to accept the walking purchase deal. Shingus was an eyewitness to the walking purchase. Shingus will reappear in our story in the 1750s and 1760s, leading raids against Pennsylvania settlers on the borderlands. After these deals with the Iroquois, there were two options for dispossessed natives. They could move away, especially to the west, if they wanted to continue to live as they had been living, or they could stay in small enclaves within Penn's colony and try to assimilate. Disputes between Pennsylvania and other colonies were also very important. The Penns were threatened by the other colonies. They had land claims against them from Maryland, I mentioned that earlier, Virginia, and even Connecticut. All of those colonies disputed the Penns' rights to territory that's part of Pennsylvania today. There was nothing gentlemanly about these disputes. They were border wars. The claims were not fully and finally resolved until the end of the American Revolution. Now, these colonial territorial disputes had an adverse impact on Pennsylvania natives. The Maryland-Pennsylvania border war of the 1730s is a good example of that. Pennsylvania and Maryland squabbled over their border from the beginning. Remember that dispute with Lord Baltimore that kept William Penn in England. In the 1730s, that's after Penn and Baltimore, Pennsylvania and Maryland actually fought each other over land west of the Susquehanna River. Maryland's strategy included sending settlers beyond the Susquehanna River. They occupied land that part of Pennsylvania today, and that in the 1730s the Penns had long since promised to Native Americans in earlier deals, some of which induced the Native Americans to move beyond the Susquehanna. Well, Maryland's action, sending settlers out there, put the Penns in a hard place. If Pennsylvania didn't send its own settlers, it risked damaging its case before the Board of Trade in England, who would weigh issues like, who do the settlers consider themselves part of? Do they consider themselves part of Maryland or Pennsylvania? That would matter to the Board of Trade. But if the Penns did send settlers, they would be breaching promises they had made in earlier treaties with Native Americans. Suffice it to say, the Penns sent settlers. Another complication was that the Pennsylvania colony didn't effectively govern the borderlands. There was no functioning government very far from Philadelphia in the mid to late 18th century. Recall Franklin's tale about Lancaster in 1763. A vigilante mob rides into town, breaks open the jail, and kills the people being held there for their protection. That sounds like an old movie, doesn't it? An old Western. The mob rides into Dodge City. Well, Lancaster was Dodge City in 1763. It was pretty lawless out there. The colony, remember, didn't have a militia, didn't have a colonial militia. And even in the 1750s, when war broke out on the borderlands, militia funding by the Colonial Assembly was sporadic and uncertain. Why was that? There was, believe it or not, you'd never see it today, there was political gridlock. There were two parties in the Pennsylvania colonial government. There was the proprietary party. That was the Penns and their allies. And there was a General Assembly. They were the executive. The General Assembly was dominated by what was called the Quaker Party. And the two parties hated each other. They found it next to impossible to compromise. One example of how difficult it was to compromise, in the 1750s when there was war in the borderlands, they couldn't get together on how to fund a colonial militia or even the local militias that had sprung up out in the West. The General Assembly said, we need a tax to do this. So we're going to tax all the land in the Commonwealth. And the Penn said, wait a minute. We are the colony. We own the colony. You can't impose a tax on our land. So they both threw up their hands and they didn't pass a tax. They didn't fund the militias. The war went on. The settlers out there said, a pox on both of your houses. We hate this government. But the settlers went further. Over the years, the settlers increasingly pressured, and by the years I mean the 18th century, they increasingly pressured the colonial government to do three things. Fully fund the militias, both a provincial militia and our local militias that we're forming on our own. Second, we want you to make aggressive war on Native Americans. And third, we want you to remove Native people from the colony, whether they've been living here for decades or not. The official policy of the colony, and it had been the official policy throughout, was to coexist with the Native American groups on the borderlands and to allow assimilating natives to live peacefully within the colony. But the pressure mounted from the settlers across the 18th century, and eventually, as you'll hear later, Pennsylvania would give in to those settlers' demands. So now we're ready to move on to the second phase of colonial history and Native Americans in Pennsylvania, and this is the time period of the wars that started in the mid-1750s. An 18th century world war started in western Pennsylvania. I won't go into how or why that happened. That's another subject for another day. But the French army arrived at Erie in May of 1753, and with their arrival, the 7 Years' War, or French and Indian War, was on its way. That was the first of the wars in Pennsylvania between the colonial government and Native Americans. That war demolished what little was left of William Penn's Peaceable Kingdom. There were three major factions in that war, at least as fought in Pennsylvania. There were the French and the Canadians as one faction. Britain and its colonies was the second faction. And the third faction was various Native American groups. None of those factions was unified. All of them had internal divisions. For example, the war goals of Pennsylvania and Virginia couldn't have been more different. Both of them wanted Western Pennsylvania as their own. And their interests, the interests of the colonies, were very different from the goals of the British Empire and its managers in London. Native American groups, too, had conflicting war aims. Natives called Ohio Indians were fighting for possession of their Western Pennsylvania land. And I'm finally going to use this easel over here to explain a little bit about the term Ohio Indians. I mentioned before that at the beginning of the 18th century, Western Pennsylvania was largely uninhabited. Over the years, in the early part of the 18th century, starting in about 1720 to 1740, the Delawares, who I mentioned earlier, Lenapes, Munsees, became the Delawares, and the Shawnees moved west across the mountains into western Pennsylvania. Why did they do that? Number one, the Iroquois was selling their land to the Penns. Number two, all those Europeans who were coming in and starting farms and settling in their midst was increasing the pressure on them. They finally decided in the 20s and 30s of the 1700s to move out beyond the mountains into the unoccupied western Pennsylvania. A third group moved out, and they're called the Ohio Iroquois. They called the Ohio Iroquois because they were people from Iroquois nations who moved down the Allegheny River and immigrated into western Pennsylvania that way. Now, there were other people, other Native Americans who made up this group called Ohio Indians. I use that term, by the way, because that's what the British called them. And indeed, in many instances, they called themselves warriors at Ohio or hunters at Ohio, because after the three groups got out there, they started to find a cohesion among themselves. And they started to establish a new society out in the previously uninhabited western Pennsylvania. And they saw themselves at times as a collective identity, although they never quite gave up their individual identities. So that's why they're called Ohio Indians. And they have a very important role, played a very important role in Pennsylvania history in colonial times. The Ohio Indians didn't like the British, the colonies, or the Iroquois. That was a result of the land deals and the settler pressure. Ohio Indians didn't much like the French either. After all, the French army had invaded their land. So at the outset of the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, where this struggle was going to occur between the British Empire and the French Empire, the Ohio Indians kind of sat on the sidelines, adopted a wait-and-see attitude. More or less, how's this going to play out between these two giants? For our purposes, the key event in the French and Indian War was General Braddock's 1755 expedition to western Pennsylvania. The invasion of Erie in 1753 was only step one in a French plan to control western Pennsylvania. Within a year, the French would build a fort in Pittsburgh called Fort Duquesne. The French supplied their native allies during the French and Indian War out of Fort Duquesne. In 1755, the British sent General Braddock with an army across the mountains towards Fort Duquesne. They met disaster. In a July 1755 battle, Braddock's army was crushed, and Braddock himself was mortally wounded. What was left of his army straggled back to the east, beyond the mountains to relative safety. With that, the Ohio Indians decided that wait and see had gone on long enough. They entered the war against Britain and its colonies. Now, that's not the same as saying they were pro-French. They weren't. They were fighting for themselves and in defense of their land. But in the fall of 1755, Ohio Indians began attacking settlers across the borderlands. The attacks usually were raids on small farms, one at a time. That was relatively easy because most of the settlers' farms were isolated. That's because most of the settlers were squatters. Nobody squats at the edge of town. You squat out where it's isolated. Many of the leaders of those raids were Delawares and Shawnees who had been forced west earlier. Shingus was among them. He and other Ohio leaders wanted to drive the settlers back to Philadelphia. So they raided settler farms. They killed most of the settlers they found, and they left the dead in a manner designed to terrorize other settlers. The raids were brutally effective. Thousands of settlers abandoned their farms and fled back to the east. In 1755 to 58, most of those Western Pennsylvania settlers were back in the east as refugees, and native warriors were free to raid within 50 or 60 miles of Philadelphia. British military couldn't do anything about it. They were still licking their wounds after Braddock. Political gridlock prevented the Pennsylvania colony from taking effective action. But Pennsylvania did declare war on Ohio Indians, specifically the Delawares and their allies, in April 1756. Among other things, that declaration of war offered bounties for Native American scalps. Yes, Pennsylvania militiamen and settlers scalped Native Americans. That brutal practice was mutual. The bounty applied to any Native American scalps. Wasn't limited to the Delawares and their allies, the nations with which the colony was at war. And it applied in varying amounts to men, women, and children. Unable to defend its borders, Pennsylvania tried to negotiate peace. In 1756 and 57, the negotiations went nowhere. Notably, those negotiations did not include the Iroquois Confederacy or the French. The native groups, mainly Ohio Indians, were firmly in control in western Pennsylvania at that time. They were doing the fighting, not the Iroquois, and French troops were holed up in their forts. Duquesne, Venango, LaBeouf, and Presque Isle. The French were supposed to be providing guns and supplies to the natives, but as the war ground on, the French were less and less able to do that, largely as a result of an effective British naval blockade of Canada. In 1758, peace negotiations finally started to gain traction. That year, General John Forbes started across Pennsylvania with a British army. Unlike Braddock, Forbes negotiated with the Ohio Indians. He wanted them to abandon the French. If they walked away, Forbes reasoned, his army could take Fort Duquesne with ease. Forbes made a simple proposal to the Ohio Indians. He said, "My goal is to expel the French. If you abandon the French, I'll kick them out and take my army back to the east." The talking continued through 1758. The natives were suspicious of Forbes, the British, and the Pennsylvania colony. But the natives had to face some hard realities in 1758. Forbes' huge army was marching toward them. The Ohio Indians were weary of war by 1758. They were suffering from 3 years of diminished harvests and diminished hunts. The French had not been doing their part in providing supplies. As negotiations dragged on, fighting between native warriors and Forbes' army broke out. Both sides suffered casualties. Forbes came very close to a Braddock-style disaster outside of modern Pittsburgh. But the fighting increased the pressure on both sides. An understanding was reached. Native warriors would abandon the French. Forbes' army would expel the French and then leave. And the British would stop settlers from coming back into western Pennsylvania. So the native warriors went home. As soon as they did, the French abandoned Fort Duquesne. They went up to the Allegheny River to their other forts. Forbes' army took Fort Duquesne without firing a shot on November 25th, 1758. But the British didn't make good on Forbes' promises. 1758 was the beginning of a long-term British military presence in western Pennsylvania. British troops stayed even after the French abandoned Venango, LaBeouf, and Presque Isle in 1759. The British built a huge fort of their own and called it Fort Pitt. After 1758, thousands of settlers again streamed across the mountains and into western Pennsylvania. By 1763, things were ready to explode again. They did. 1763 brought a second war between the colony and native groups, called Pontiac's War. I mentioned it briefly earlier. Pontiac's War had many causes. One was the failure to keep Forbes's promises, but there were others. British policies adopted at the end of the 7 Years' War were very important causes. The British stopped giving gifts of supplies to natives. That caused economic hardship. Recall I mentioned earlier that the natives had become economically dependent on European trade goods. But most important, the British quit supplying guns and ammunition. That caused an inability to hunt. One winter in the 1758 to 63 period is remembered by native historians as the Powder Famine winter. In May of 1763, Pontiac, an Ottawa leader who lived near Fort Detroit, began a siege of that fort. For their part, Ohio Indians launched attacks on British posts across western Pennsylvania. Native warriors laid siege to Fort Pitt. In mid-June of 1763, they captured the British forts at Venango, LaBeouf, and Presque Isle. The Pennsylvania borderlands, once again, were largely defenseless. Thousands of settlers again returned to the east, and the colonial government was once again gridlocked. As before, local militias took action. Notable among them were the Paxton Boys, who I mentioned earlier. The Paxtons were angry in 1763. They were angry at the colony for its inaction. They were angry at King George III because they felt the empire was siding with the natives against the settlers. That point was punctuated by a proclamation that George III issued in 1763 declaring that no British settlements should be west of the Allegheny Mountains. That proclamation was issued when there were already hundreds, if not thousands, of settlers living west of the Allegheny Mountains. As I mentioned earlier, the Paxton Boys hated natives, and not just those who were leading raids against the frontier. The Paxtons thought there were no friendly or even neutral natives. They thought that the friendly and neutral natives were spies for the warring natives. The Paxtons were paranoid. Their paranoia grew when they were ambushed in August of 1763. In October, the Paxtons came across what's been called the Wyoming Massacre. The 10 dead settlers that they found that had been left there by native warriors had been tortured and mutilated. The Paxtons were enraged. Word of the King's proclamation line reached Pennsylvania in early December 1763. The stage, sadly, was set for the Conestoga massacres that Franklin wrote about. As I said, the Paxtons weren't prosecuted for the Conestoga massacres. That failure itself, that failure to prosecute the Paxton Boys, was another disaster for Native Americans. In 1763, the colonial government of Pennsylvania had friendship treaties with many, many native groups and had declared war on only a few native nations, specifically the Delawares and the Shawnees, the Ohio Indians. The Paxton Boys, however, acted on their own indifferent public policy. Their policy was that all native people are enemies. In a sense, the Paxton Boys had made their own vigilante law, and they got away with it. That lesson wasn't lost on other frontier settlers, many of whom also felt that native people were all enemies, and reached the conclusion that if they killed natives, the colony couldn't or wouldn't stop them. By 1763, native people trying to assimilate into the Pennsylvania colony were in danger all over the province. In Pennsylvania, Pontiac's War kind of just dribbled away. After it became clear that the French were gone for good, Pontiac lifted his siege of Detroit. British troops were able to relieve Fort Pitt, and the Delawares and Shawnees in western Pennsylvania eventually stopped their raids. And in defiance of King George III's proclamation of 1763, colonial settlers resumed crossing the mountains in greater numbers than ever before. Native Americans, for their part, continued moving west and out of Pennsylvania in larger numbers than before. In November of 1768, Pennsylvania made yet another deal with the Iroquois. In that treaty, the Iroquois conceded to the Penn family everything the Penns wanted. Specifically, the deed from the Iroquois to the Penn family said that they were deeding over, quote, all the land in the province not previously deeded to the proprietary family. After that, still more Native Americans moved west and out of Pennsylvania. For the natives who didn't leave, the Revolutionary War was the ultimate disaster. During the Revolution, Native groups split over which side to support. A few Native groups sided with the American Patriots. The Oneidas, one of the Iroquois family of nations, is a conspicuous example of siding with the American Patriots. More groups sided with the British. The majority of Western Pennsylvania groups eventually sided with the British. After that, they raided colonial settlements, much like the raids during the 7 Years' War and Pontiac's War. A few Western Pennsylvania Native groups tried to stay neutral throughout the Revolution, but neutral ground again proved to be no man's land. Many Pennsylvania militiamen took the view that there were no neutrals, much like the Paxtons. An example of that was in 1782, and the war in western Pennsylvania raged long after Yorktown. It continued right up to and really beyond 1783. But in March of 1783, just west of the modern Pennsylvania-Ohio line, a group of Christianized natives lived. They lived in a missionary village called Nadenhooten. In March of that year, 1782, Pennsylvania militiamen arrived at Nadenhooten. They killed all the natives they found. 28 men, 29 women, 39 children. 96 people in all. The commander of that Pennsylvania militia, Colonel David Williamson, was later elected sheriff of Washington County, PA. Now, what conclusions can be drawn about Penn's colony and Native Americans? I started tonight with those images of William Penn and the Lenapes. What we see in those images is historical myth-making. In particular, the Benjamin West painting that Thomas Penn commissioned in 1771 is myth-making. It depicts a peaceful Pennsylvania scene from 90 years earlier. But Thomas Penn's commission was just 8 years after the Conestoga massacres. Massacres that happened and went unpunished while Thomas Penn was the colony's proprietor. Now, I'm not saying there isn't truth to the William Penn images. Far from it. William Penn respected natives much more than the leaders of other British colonies, and much more than his heirs. His mostly peaceable kingdom lasted over 70 years, long after Penn's death. But despite William Penn's good intentions, his colonial project harmed native people from the beginning. That harm was inherent in Penn's plan to sell land to thousands and thousands of Europeans. To his credit, William Penn's vision for the colony included both Europeans and Native Americans. But coexistence was always to be on European terms. In the Pennsylvania that Penn proposed to share with the natives, they were to give up their land, their culture, their economy, and all political control. Some native groups refused Penn's terms. They chose to move west to fight, or both. The Delawares and Shawnees are good examples of that. The Delawares and Shawnees who moved west became part of a group called Ohio Indians. They fought fiercely and effectively against the Pennsylvania colony for a period of about 30 years. Other Native Americans tried to live inside the colony on Penn's terms. They tried to assimilate. Ultimately, they weren't able to do so. When war came to the Peaceable Kingdom, it was brutal and terroristic. Assimilated natives tried to find and live on neutral ground. But in the end, there was no neutral ground. That was proven at Conestoga in 1763 and at Gnadenhutten in 1782 and in the native warriors' raids against colonial settlements. An argument can be made that the impact of these 18th century wars can be felt in Pennsylvania still today. The United States censuses of 2000 and 2010 ranked Pennsylvania among the states 50th and 49th in the percentage of Native American residents. And Pennsylvania alone, among the 13 original colonies, has no native reservation today. With that, I'll be happy to try to answer any questions that you may have.
If you do have a question, just raise your hand and I can come meet you with the microphone. Going once? Going twice? All right, thank you all for coming out tonight. If you do have any private questions you'd like to ask, I think we still have a few more minutes that Larry Flatley could answer for you.